On note chez Picasso un dialogue constant entre sa peinture et sa sculpture, chaque domaine de création se nourrissant réciproquement de l'autre. Picasso a à plusieurs reprises affirmé son désir irrépressible de peindre ses sculptures, de les colorier, ce sont ses mots. Et nous allons maintenant discuter de la question de la polychromie en sculpture. Donc tout d'abord avec Ileana Parvu, professeure d'histoire et théorie de l'art au département des arts visuels à la Haute École d'art et de design de Genève. Donc Ileana Parvu va nous faire une présentation intitulée « À l'épreuve de la troisième dimension, la représentation picturale dans la sculpture de Picasso ».
Merci. Et merci donc pour l'organisation de ce colloque. Donc, à l'épreuve de la troisième dimension, ce dont je parlerai ici, ce sont des objets de Picasso que Picasso a fait essentiellement dans l'année en 1914. Donc, je les appelle des objets. Alors, ce sont des formes qui sont tout à fait inédites, des formes d'art. Donc, c'est pas vraiment de la sculpture, c'est pas non plus des tableaux. C'est peut-être des entre-deux. On les a appelés des tableaux reliefs. Et on les appelle aussi des constructions. Et je pense que c'est un bon terme pour ces objets, pour ce que j'aime appeler aussi des objets. Alors, ces constructions qui se font peut-être donc en 1914 dans un prolongement par rapport aux guitares de 1912, ce sont, tels que j'aimerais vous les montrer aujourd'hui ici, c'est en tant qu'expérimentation picturale, ce qui ne veut pas dire qu'il s'agit là d'instruments pour produire des peintures. Ça, j'aimerais le dire. Donc, il n'y a pas ce rapport de subordination, comme ça, entre la troisième dimension et la peinture. Il ne s'agit pas du tout de cela, évidemment. Et à mon avis, j'espère qu'on aura, si possible, le temps d'en discuter, il s'agit plutôt de déployer une théorie picturale en faisant incursion dans le domaine tridimensionnel. Alors, je vais vous montrer quelques exemples. Et je ne peux pas, évidemment, ne pas faire référence ici au travail de Rosalind Krauss et d'Yves Alain-Bois, qui est donc ce qu'ils ont tenté de faire, c'est une sémiologie du cubisme, c'est-à-dire tenter d'appliquer un modèle linguistique au cubisme des années 12 et 13, et surtout donc au papier collé de Picasso. Alors, on a à l'écran la construction vers, pipe, as de trèfle et dé. Et donc, on a ici le code pictural qui ferait signe, qui constituerait un signe dans le sens linguistique du terme, dans le sens de saussure, c'est-à-dire que l'élément cylindrique que vous voyez tout en haut, qui s'avance vers le spectateur, renverrait, alors c'est là que ça devient un peu mystérieux, parce qu'il renverrait peut-être à la cavité du verre, à mon avis, ce serait le signe de la cavité. Le seul problème dans ce ton d'eau, c'est que la pipe est mentionnée dans le titre. Enfin, je ne veux pas faire de développement sur les titres, je crois qu'on n'a pas le temps, mais elle est difficilement visible. Je pense qu'elle n'est pas vraiment dans le ton d'eau. Enfin, on pourra peut-être en discuter. Voilà, je vais passer peut-être à l'autre. Je ne sais pas comment... Ah, c'est comme ça, c'est moi qui passe. D'accord. Voilà. Donc, sur le signe, Jean Clay parlait aussi de ce travail sur la représentation picturale comme code. Donc, le travail dans le cubisme serait aussi une expérimentation de la distance plus ou moins grande, ou même peut-être parfois inexistante, entre le référent, ce qu'on appelle en linguistique le référent, donc l'objet extérieur à la représentation cubiste, et puis la représentation cubiste. Alors, bon, ce papier collé de 1912 le montrait très très bien, puisqu'on a comme une citation du vers, de la façon cubiste de représenter un vers. on a une partition, alors qui est un peu le parangon du code de la représentation, enfin, ou de la notation, donc dans le rapport à la musique, hein, notation, une partition. Ce blanc qui renvoie au vide, mais qui est quand même très matériellement là, puisqu'il s'agit d'un cercle découpé, et le journal qui figure un journal. Enfin, donc à chaque fois, cette expérimentation d'un lien entre signe et référent, et ce lien qui se raccourcit jusqu'à ce que le signe fusionne en fait avec le référent. Alors c'est le cas dans le journal, dans le papier peint du fond, et la distance est très très grande évidemment entre le verre et le référent, le verre cubiste et le référent extérieur au papier collé. Alors, dans la sculpture de 1950, c'est assez intéressant, dans cet exemple de la petite fille sautant à la corde, où on a les chaussures qui représentent des chaussures, donc très petite distance, et la corbeille qui renvoie au haut du corps de la petite fille. Alors, retour à 1914, 1912, pardon, avec la guitare. Et donc là, pour assister à cette transplantation du code pictural dans la troisième dimension. Donc on a cette petite guitare de 1912 où, je ne peux pas montrer, hein, je pense avec ça, si. Mais, ah oui, il faut que je montre ici. Bon, enfin, de toute façon, on le voit. Donc, du côté gauche, c'est ça, l'ombre portée qui est figurée. Et donc, on a un objet qui est fait de plans de papier, donc qui a une épaisseur quand même assez grande, et qui ne va pas projeter lui-même son ombre, mais l'ombre est représentée. Alors, on a ici à nouveau cette ombre, l'ombre du dé qui est peinte sur le rebord de la boîte à cigares, exactement, merci. Alors, j'avance ici les cordes de la guitare qui sont réunies en un seul point, une espèce de faisceau qui renvoie à la construction géométrique de la perspective. Ici, à nouveau, l'arrondi du verre, ce modelé qui est représenté, et donc on n'a pas une véritable... Enfin, on n'a pas un arrondi effectif dans l'objet lui-même. Le verre est représenté sur un plan. Alors, le plan s'avance. Il y a évidemment cette spatialité réelle qui est présente, mais l'arrondi est représenté sur un plan. Et il est représenté avec des moyens picturaux, donc avec... ce modelé. Je passe peut-être, puisque on va signaler donc là d'autres exemples. Alors, ce qui m'intéressait aussi, de vous montrer, c'est tous ces jeux optiques, ce que j'appellerais des jeux optiques, et donc la possibilité d'avoir des effets virtuels qui est porté sur des objets en 3 dimensions. Et donc, on peut arriver dans cette construction de 1914, bouteille de Basse, verre et journal, on arrive à voir le relief du fait qu'il est représenté. Et donc, dans l'alignement entre le trait noir sur le verre et ce bout de fer qui est peint en blanc et qui se retourne, qui montre l'autre face, on peut voir cet arrondi du verre, mais on le voit sans qu'il soit là. Il est représenté dans la 3e dimension, alors même que c'est un objet tridimensionnel. Alors, peut-être juste encore un point avant de terminer. Il me semble que là, Picasso essaye de transplanter non pas seulement le code pictural dans la troisième dimension, mais aussi de tester l'espace pictural et de voir s'il tient, si cet espace pictural tient dans l'espace du spectateur, dans l'espace non représenté, ou alors on pourrait dire aussi hors cadre, hein, porter l'espace pictural hors du cadre du tableau. Et donc là, bon, je vous montre cette construction extrêmement célèbre, hein, au joueur de guitare qui date de 1913. Et donc ce joueur représenté qui arrive à jouer de la guitare dans l'espace du spectateur. Et bien sûr, alors on sort de la peinture, mais il y a aussi un retour vers la deuxième dimension, hein. C'est des expérimentations tridimensionnelles et qui ont une incidence, hein, je n'en dirai pas plus puisque le temps est très court, sur la deuxième dimension, puisque là on voit que Picasso va cacher donc ici des portions de l'image photographique, ou alors il va dessiner à l'encre au-dessus. Donc c'est un va-et-vient en fait entre la deuxième et la troisième dimension. Alors, juste une petite sortie hors de Picasso avec ce White Angle de 1966 d'Elsa Scully, voilà, où il me semble donc des œuvres des années 60, l'artiste américain Elsa Scully, ce sont des angles, vous le voyez ici au Guggenheim Museum à New York, et donc là cet espace de la couleur qui est aussi, à mon avis, mise à l'épreuve de la spatialité hors représentation, disons, enfin de l'espace du spectateur. Et pour finir, dernière image. Alors, on a cela aussi du côté de Picasso, à mon avis, avec de tout autres moyens. Par exemple, La femme aux bras écartés de 1961, dans ce fond, hein, qui sort aussi du tableau et qui borde par portion la statue, la sculpture de femme. Voilà, merci, je m'arrête là.
Merci beaucoup, Eliana Pervu. Donc, je partage avec vous cette idée que les tableaux-reliefs, donc cette catégorie hybride entre peinture et sculpture, ainsi que les constructions, sont véritablement des objets. Et nous avons choisi de les présenter dans l'exposition, ainsi que dans l'accrochage précédent, décadrés. Donc accrochés comme des sculptures dans la vitrine, dans une vitrine murale, et non pas considérés comme des peintures. J'ai une question pour vous. Vous nous avez parlé du cygne, et je voulais simplement vous demander qu'est-ce que pour vous apporte la couleur à l'expressivité du cygne.
Alors, la couleur, je pense qu'elle est plutôt, elle est pas du côté du cygne, en fait. Hein. Ce que j'ai essayé de montrer, c'est partir comme ça du cygne qui serait figé dans la troisième dimension, et ensuite partir du côté, donc je suis passée très vite en parlant des jeux optiques, en fait, à quelque chose qui n'a rien à voir avec le cygne, hein, qui est plutôt de l'ordre de la perception et de la phénoménologie de la perception. C'est quelque chose que Wollheim appelle le voir comme, hein, c'est-à-dire que, et c'est là que Picasso utilise les propriétés de la couleur, le clair qui s'avance par rapport à une couleur sombre, etc. Donc, ce serait un hors-champ par rapport au cygne, hein, à la couleur.
Très bien, merci. Est-ce qu'il y a une question dans la salle? Ah oui, non, nous enchaînons et nous laisserons à la fin de la table ronde un temps d'échange avec l'audience. Donc j'appelle à présent à nous présenter Louise Mahler, qui nous parlera de Painting and Sculpture, Picasso's Polychrome Works. Donc Louise Mahler est historienne de l'art et chercheur associée au Leonard Lauder Collection à New York. Louise Mahler a participé aux recherches pour le catalogue de l'exposition Cubism de Leonard Lauder Collection, organisée au Metropolitan Museum de New York d'octobre 2014 à février 2015. Elle fut récemment Assistant Curator au Museum of Modern Art de New York et co-auteur de la chronologie détaillée du catalogue de l'exposition Picasso Sculpture qui s'est tenue au MoMA de septembre 2015 à février dernier. Louise?
Merci. Merci, Virginie. I would like to thank Cécile and you for inviting me to speak on the topic of, in the microphone. Thank you. And I have to apologize for my voice. It was lost somewhere between New York and Paris. So thank you for inviting me to speak on the topic of Picasso's painted sculptures, and thank you to everyone at the Musée Picasso for organizing this international colloquium. You really have made us all felt extremely welcomed and kept us well fed. So thank you. I would also like to express my gratitude to the numerous scholars and colleagues who have contributed to the research of Picasso's painted sculptures, and I clearly stand on their shoulders, and my paper is indebted in no small part to their work. Okay, so here we go. While my paper will primarily focus on the beginnings of Picasso's use of polychromy in sculpture and the Verre d'Absinthe of 1914 in particular, I will also draw on a later moment in the artist's practice of painting bronzes, the period of 1951 to 1953, specifically, during which Picasso made La Grue and La Liseuse, other types of painted bronzes, in order to examine the question of seriality within this body of work. My research emerged from working on the recent Picasso sculpture exhibition at MoMA, and what became apparent to me at the time is that museum audiences, curators, and scholars, myself very much included, loved the idea of having the Verre d'Absinthe presented together in a series rather than as 6 individual sculptures made from one and the same form, even though Picasso probably never intended for them to be seen in that way, as my study of key sources will show. And I'm showing you here an installation view of Werner Spies' exhibition Picasso Plastiken at the Nationalgalerie in Berlin in 1983, the first time it was attempted to bring together all 6 Verre d'Absinthe. He brought together 5, which was no small feat, and the only one that he didn't bring was the Lauder cast, and that's probably because it was an unknown. It's unknown to me, even though I spent a lot of time researching it for the Lauder collection, where the object was in 1983. Then I'm showing you the installation at MoMA, all 6 glasses, but each on its own pedestal. And then here we are, right now in the present, at the Musée Picasso in Paris. Identical in shape, each of the Verre d'Absinthe was painted differently by Picasso. And it is the application of color, or polychromy as we can say, in these sculptures that will help situate Picasso's decision to produce a set of 6 within the context of artistic debates on the subject of color in sculpture and seriality. Picasso painted his 3-dimensional objects throughout of his career. We saw examples today, just now, and of course in the exhibition. And you might recall the small tête carved into a piece of birch tree from 1907 that is currently on view at the museum. In these early explorations of painting sculpture, Picasso was influenced by Paul Gauguin and the African and oceanic objects that he had seen at the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro and collected, but also by the variedly painted figurines of his native Malaga, which I will show to you in a moment. Yet in early 1914, Picasso shifted gears, to borrow an expression Guillaume Apollinaire used in 1912 to describe the quote, and I quote, the sudden and yet tender changes in the work of Alexander Archipenko. in the way Picasso used his paint in his cubist relief constructions and the Ver d'Absinthe. In these works, one no longer finds the reduced palette of black and white in addition to the innate brown of the wood found in the relief constructions of late 1913, a number of which were published in Apollinaire's Les Soirées de Paris in November that year, nor the strips of colored paper pasted onto the small cardboard guitar that we just saw in Ilara's presentation, and which is in the collection of the Musée Picasso. In early 1914, Picasso began to apply color either on the entirety of the construction or the majority of its surface, probably oil or possibly enamel paint. The color not only enlivened the objects, but also helped distinguish the individual elements included in these still life arrangements. Polychromy was a hotly debated topic in the late 19th century, following the discovery of excavations of ancient sculptures showing traces of paint, which in turn revived the question of the use of color in sculpture. In the Western tradition from the Renaissance onward, highest regard was given to pure or monochromatic sculpture, carved in marble or stone, and emphasizing form. Academia tolerated the use of innate color of a given material and the mixing of these materials, but spoke out against applied color on the grounds of its hiding the sculptor's talent and bringing the carved object into too close proximity with illusionistic painting and nature. Spanish sculptors, and artisans formed an exception, and they continued the tradition of polychromy in sculpture. And I'm showing, I missed that slide. These were the construction I was talking about earlier. And those are two versions of Barros figurines depicting Spanish bullfighters from the collection of popular arts and costumes in Malaga. These figures were ubiquitous during Picasso's childhood and formed part of the many cultures from the artist's early life that later influenced Picasso, argued by Natasha Staller. One of the first modern artists to use paint in sculpture was Archipenko, whose work Ilara discussed yesterday. Archipenko's sculptures offered the most innovative ideas in working in 3 dimensions. His sculptures were abstract, transparent, and painted. You see them in the top of my slide. Another artist contemporary to both Archipenko and Picasso was the Italian futurist painter and sculptor Umberto Boccioni, whom we will hear more later this afternoon. He had written the Manifesto Tecnico della Scultura Futurista in 1912, and it was translated, the manifesto was translated immediately into French and published in Paris in October that year. And following, in the summer of 1913, Boccioni presented his so-called ensemble plastique at the Galerie La Boétie in Paris. Among the 11 plastic ensembles included in this first exhibition of futurist sculpture were 2 plasters of the development of a bottle in space, which you see at the bottom right of my slide, a sculpture that is often compared to Picasso's Ver d'Absinthe. Filippo Tommaso Marinetti recalled Picasso's presence at the exhibition, and it seems that Picasso may have attended Boccioni's conference on futurist sculpture, which had been promoted in the catalog and which was held in June of 1913. The works that Picasso would have seen then were 2 plaster casts of the development of a bottle in space, one in its natural color, plaster white, and given the subtitle as form, and the other one with the subtitle as color, painted in a vermilion red lead paint, not unsimilar or dissimilar to Archipenko's Madonna of the Rocks, and I thank Rosalind for sharing this information with me. So Boccioni's work not only offered another instance of color applied to 3-dimensional form, within the context of avant-garde art, but it also showed Boccioni's meditation on how color might change the perception of a three-dimensional form. And the viewer was asked to ponder the idea of creating variance in sculpture by applying color. Subsequently, the Salon des Indépendants of early 1914, which featured, among other sculptures, Archipenko's 1913 Carrousel Pierrot, staged another encounter with painted sculpture. And whether or not Picasso saw this exhibition, it is important here to review or remind ourselves of Apollinaire's review of this exhibition. Apollinaire wrote in March 1914 in La Transigeance, "Here one can see," and I quote him, "here one can see Archipenko's sculptures. One of them is made of different materials, glass, zinc, wood, all polychromed. It represents a very great effort to go beyond the conventional in sculpture. Those of my colleagues who are so certain that they possess the ultimate truth in aesthetics have, of course, the right not to mention such a surprising work executed with such ease and grace. As for me, I'm happy to say how delighted I was at the sight of such delicate work." Ultimately, Apollinaire's defense of the Russians' charming and delightful polychrome works that went beyond the conventions of traditional sculptures cost him his position at the newspaper. But one should underscore that the admiration Apollinaire felt for these small, delicate works that brought him such delight would have an effect on Picasso. Knowing of the close friendship between the critic and the artist, it is reasonable to imagine that the poet may have served as an interlocutor between Archipenko and Picasso on the subject of polychromy in sculpture. Furthermore, it is telling that Picasso must have conceived of the wax original of the Vert d'Absinthe, and the wax he would have used would have had a red color around this time, since the bronzes for the Vert d'Absinthe were finished by April 1914, as Diana has informed us this morning. Looking at the individual painted bronzes of the Vert d'Absinthe, one notices the care applied to each plane with a distinct color pattern, not unlike Archipenko's Carrousel Pierrot. And here you see he was very careful in delineating the black from the white, for example. So let's return to the question of seriality and Picasso's decision to have a set of 6 bronzes cast in the spring of 1914. Similar to polychromy, seriality in painting and sculpture was widely discussed and practiced among modern artists at the turn of the 20th century. Without wanting to dwell on the subject too much, I would like us to recall Claude Monet's famous exhibitions of his serial paintings at the Galerie Durand-Roll. And even though Picasso did not see the earlier exhibitions, he may have seen the 1909 presentation. What seems relevant is that, like Monet's various series, Picasso's Vert d'Absinthe appears to constitute, and I quote here a term by Charles Stuckey, constitute a performance of variations on a set theme. Stuckey charts these performances across a breathtaking number of 18th, 19th, and 20th century artists, ranging from David to Rodin to Matisse. And it could also be applied, albeit perhaps with less rigor, to Boccioni's meditations on form and color in the development of a bottle in space. Rodin, for example, reacted to the circulation and proliferation of mass-produced sculptures by combining 2 or more of the same sculptures in groups. His plaster 3 shades was included as a single figure, as a group, and in a photograph showing the group by Eugène Drouet in the artist's 1900 retrospective at the Pavilion d'Alma in Paris. When Picasso visited the exhibition, which I believe is highly likely, it would have been difficult to miss Rodin's clever response to the current demands for copies of the same sculpture. Between 1910 and 1914, Picasso was confronted with seeing his own sculptures multiplied in ever greater number. In late 1910, the Parisian dealer Ambroise Vollard had purchased 5 of the artist's early sculptures, and 3 of them, including the 1909 Cubist Tête de Femme, were met with immediate commercial success. While Vollard's archives for the years prior to World War I are sketchy, as Diana has shown, we know that by 1913, 3 major collectors, Vincent Kramasch in Prague, Alfred Stieglitz in New York, and Alfred Flechtheim in Berlin and Düsseldorf, had acquired bronze casts of Picasso's early sculptures and lent them to exhibitions in the US and in Central Europe, a geographic region of great interest to Picasso's Cubist dealer Daniel Henrik Kahnweiler, who collaborated with the artist on making the Verre d'Absinthe. Kahnweiler had missed out on buying Picasso's early sculptures, and Vollard was in no way limited by law or agreement in producing as many copies as the market demanded. In response to these many complex interrelated considerations of artistic practices and market trends, Picasso and Kahnweiler came up with a solution for the Verre d'Absinthe that is as ingenious in its artistic imagination as it is in terms of its marketing strategy. Picasso and Kahnweiler decided to produce a set of 6 identical glasses, and what I'm showing you here are mock-ups of what the casts would have looked like before Picasso painted it. So they created a set of glasses not unlike the ones you would buy in a store, but with the intention of creating 6 unique objects through the application of paint. And these mock-ups were made by my colleague and sparring partner in researching these objects, Linda Zeikerman, conservator of sculpture at MoMA, and I'm deeply indebted to her contributions. One of the 6 glasses would remain with Picasso, and the other 5 would enter Kahnweiler's stock with the intention of selling them to collectors such as Kramasch in Prague. For Picasso, the decision to make 6 copies of one form provided him not only with the opportunity of treating a single motif in a variety of ways, which was characteristic of Picasso's working methods during the Cubist period, but also with a chance to explore a representational problem quite literally from all points of view. For Kahnweiler, the decision meant that he could sell each sculpture at the considerably high price of 1,000 francs, and that equaled a canvas of 25 points according to the December 12 letter contract, so at about 80 by 60 centimeters large canvas. And that no other copies could be made. Also, and unlike Vollard, Kahnweiler numbered and had his initials marked on each of the casts, adding another layer of limitation upon himself and Picasso, so they couldn't be reproduced further. Picasso as well as Kahnweiler asserted their respective control over the edition of the Verre d'Absinthe. They were also over the Verre d'Absinthe, meant to be seen as individual sculptures, or in the plural, as Werner Spies argues. What is key is to also look at the exhibition history, and it turns out that they were never exhibited as a group while the artist was alive during Picasso's lifetime. In fact, when the opportunity presented itself in 1936, Picasso did not lend his painted bronze to André Breton for the Exposition Surréaliste d'Objets at the Galerie Charles Raton. I have 2 more minutes. Thank you. And if we go back, they would have been at the opposite end of the series. So this glass and the one at bottom center, the Berggruen one. According to an undated handwritten checklist, Breton had at first thought to include only the cast of only one cast of the Ver d'Absinthe, but then later met with Picasso in his studio and consulted with him, and was successful in receiving 5 additional bronzes. So he had ample opportunity to ask for a second cast of the Glass of Absinthe. And I think that it would have been known to Breton that more than one cast existed, because 2 of them had been published by Servoz in 1928. But to my knowledge, this is the only publication that showed 2 variants of the Ver d'Absinthe prior to 1942, when Servoz published the 2nd volume of his catalogue Raisonné. And you see here that, again, only 5 are reproduced. The one that's missing is Picasso's own copy. So it took until 1983, the 2nd edition of Werner Spiess's, no, I'm sorry, now I'm confusing the works. Until 1979, Pierre Dex's catalogue Raisonné of the Cubist works, that all 6 were reproduced in one publication. And Servoz would have had a chance again to include Picasso's copy, because we know that he possessed photographs of the glass that belonged to Picasso. And I thank Diana for sharing this information about the Servoz archive. Picasso's glass was not published until 1949, when it was included in the monograph Les Sculptures de Picasso. So as with the Ver d'Absinthe, Picasso's edition of 4 bronze casts of La Grue and La Liseuse made in the 1950s, they constitute similar groups of similar yet dissimilar works. As the 1914 sculpture, the 2 later objects were produced at a time when Picasso was thinking of reproducibility of his work. In the late 1940s, he began to explore ceramics, a medium that traditionally operates in additions and multiples of the same form. And by the early 1950s, he had accomplished a prolific production of ceramics. Neither of these 2 series was exhibited or published in its entirety during the artist's lifetime, with the exception of one exhibition in 1953 at the Galerie Louise Leiris, where 2 casts of the woman reading were included. But it seems that one was added at the last moment, because it's only listed in the supplement to the exhibition catalog. So in conclusion, and in light of this research pertaining to the visibility of the works in their entirety during Picasso's lifetime, how can we explain the desire among scholars and curators to see especially all of the 6 Ver d'Absinthe together? There are a number of possible answers which I can think of, but I'm sure there are others. And one is that reuniting them for the first time after more than 100 years constitutes a significant scholarly and curatorial achievement. But, and that seeing all 6 glasses also allows us to draw conclusions about Picasso's painting process, and to see, as Pepe Camel has convincingly argued, that the 6 could also be seen as 3 pairs. But above all, having all 6 Ver d'Absinthe assembled in one gallery space is illustrative of the wish to enter perhaps into Picasso's artistic mind, and in turn to understand better the endless facets of his inventiveness. Thank you so much for your patience.
Merci beaucoup, Louise, pour cet exposé très riche. Et merci pour avoir situé la question de la polychromie dès la fin du XIXe siècle. Effectivement, on peut tirer un lien entre cette question de peindre la sculpture avec ce débat qui était en cours à la fin du XIXe siècle. Peindre les sculptures n'était pas quelque chose d'académique, et on peut reprendre cette formule d'Apollinaire en effet en disant que Picasso, en peignant ses sculptures, est allé au-delà de la convention. Merci aussi d'avoir souligné le lien entre polychromie et sérialité. Effectivement, la peinture, le décor peint offre tout un potentiel de variation à Picasso pour transformer ces multiples en exemplaires uniques. Et on voit bien que cette question de la sérialité était intégrée dans le processus créatif de Picasso. J'en viens à une question qui est peut-être une question un peu complexe. Est-ce qu'on peut dire que Picasso était le premier véritablement à peindre ces bronzes? Est-ce qu'on peut lui donner l'invention du bronze peint?
No, I don't think so. And I'm thankful to, at least not among artists in general, and I'm thankful again to Linda Zykerman. We know of examples of painted bronzes in medieval art and in Renaissance art, and in fact, painting directly with oil paint on copper, for example, ensures that the paint will stick to the metal ground for a very, very long time. And as in the case of the Ver d'Absinthe, Picasso painted directly on the bronze, and they're remarkable for how pristine their condition is. So no, I don't think that Picasso was the first. And he would have seen many examples during his visits to the Louvre and in his native Spain.
Oui, effectivement, vous avez montré. Oui, bien sûr.
Thank you.
Fantastically interesting, but for me, the glasses offer two more things which are essential. It's a whole, it's a space that comes after the guitar, and I think that is essential. That's the other Archipenko and Boccioni has not done that. And then you have the little spoon, that's objet trouvé, So it's not only the paint, but it is a hole, and it is a little spoon. Yeah. So it's a unique. It's a sweet time unique.
Yeah, absolutely, Carmen. And I'm the last to not admit that there are so many facets of the Ver d'Absinthe that are absolutely fascinating. But I think that these two aspects have been exhaustively argued for. And so I really was struck by the fact how much we are in love in seeing them together, even though Picasso intended them to be individually seen. So I focused in this paper on that question, and of course in a larger discussion these aspects have to be accounted for. Yeah, please.
Thank you for this rigorous reading. I have two in one question.
I'm sorry if I'm squinting.
Of course, I want to take your suggestion very seriously, to think about it indeed as a series. And when I was doing that, I was thinking about, I was thinking about Picasso's quote from 1932 when he spoke about seriality as the tracing of the mind, the sort of like movement from one phase to the other, which made me think about readings such as like the classic Leo Steinberg of The Women from Algiers. And I was trying to think, when I was looking at your presentation, trying to see whether there was a specific logic in the way in which you've decided to couple the six. Yeah. And if so, what sort of narrative, what sort of movement of the artist's mind you can extract from that?
I mean, the way I sequenced them is in the way they are marked on the inside of the bottom. So the glass that stayed with Picasso is marked 0, and it was probably the artist's proof, and the remaining 5 are marked with Roman numerals 1 through 5 and with Kahnweiler's initials. And we have organized them in this order because it corresponds to the reading of those 6 in 3 distinct pairs. You have the 2 monochrome ones, you have the next pair is a black and a white pendant, and then the last pair are perhaps the ones that are most intricate in their surface pattern and really defy the object as being read as a glass. So these were very practical, originally very practical reasons of organizing them in sequence, but I think they also correspond to a way that Picasso thought of painting them. We know by looking at the surface paint texture that he may have gone back and forth between the glasses 2 and 4, and that 5, the Berggruen one, was in many ways a glass where Picasso sort of had figured out things. You no longer have the mixing of the white with the black. The shapes are very clearly delineated. But nonetheless, it corresponds because of the swirl, which suggests the volume of the glass, and which you find in many of the papier-collés and paintings of the period. They correspond with each other. Yeah. But
Merci beaucoup. Nous allons passer à la présentation de Christine Poggi. Christine Poggi est professeure au département d'histoire de l'art de l'Université de Pennsylvanie à Philadelphie. Elle est l'auteure de plusieurs publications, notamment sur le cubisme et le futurisme. Ici, c'est à la sculpture tardive de Picasso qu'elle s'intéresse, en quoi la dialectique peinture et sculpture est repensée par la multiplicité des points de vue qu'offre la troisième dimension. The paradox of the pictorial in Picasso's late sculpture.
Thank you very much, and I also want to thank the organizers of this conference who've been very generous and brought us all together, so I won't mention everyone's name for a lack of time, but thank you very much. Okay, the current exhibition, which I was able to study more closely in New York, of Picasso's sculpture offers a remarkable occasion for new thinking on the relation of Picasso's work in 2 and 3 dimensions. In this paper, I will attend to one significant current within the artist's highly varied production, his exploration of the paradoxical intermingling of pictorial and sculptural modes of representation. What would happen, Picasso seems to ask, if he transposed the conventions of picture making, which entail the production of illusion on a flat, delimited surface through perspective, drawing, chiaroscuro, color and value contrasts, fictive cast shadows, and even the supplement of the frame, all of those things, into the 3-dimensional world of sculptural objects. What if the frontality, unity, and simultaneity of painting's mode of address were retained, but made to operate in the round, through a sequence of planar but folded and tilted, always partial views? What if the temporality of changing perceptions and the contingency of objects seen in variable conditions of light entered the viewer's experience through a sculptural translation of painterly devices? And I'll just briefly mention these earlier works before moving on to some of the later ones. We can see Picasso's interest in exploring these possibilities in his earliest constructed guitars of 1912. Although these assemblages of paper, cardboard, bits of newspaper, canvas, and string are more or less planar and meant to hang on the wall like pictures or reliefs, they also destabilize the assumed frontality and transparency of the picture plane as the very ground of representation. Treating this plane as a material element projected into space, Picasso subjected it to cutting, multiplication, folding, tilting, and perforation. At the same time, the multiplied and angled paper and cardboard planes continue to serve as the pictorial ground for further figuration. In the guitar on the right, as has just been mentioned, in fact, the artist drew and shaded a side and top view of a guitar onto a plane that continues to read as flat and which has its own literal contours. This shading makes the guitar seem to swivel to the viewer's right, exposing more of the left side of the work than a purely frontal view would provide. But this orientation is contradicted by the fact that the central projecting plane, bearing the guitar's sound hole and 3 drawn strings, clearly tilts to the left. This projecting plane also undergoes a form of perspectival diminution, paradoxically rendered literal in 3 dimensions, as its sides recede toward the top, where it vanishes beneath a folded fingerboard that reverses this perspectival effect. In the other small guitar, here on the left, Picasso made the 4 guitar strings converge as they descend toward a pictorial vanishing point below the sound hole, again rendered actual. The strings literally disappear into the body of this inclined plane. Picasso also affixed 2 strips of blue laid paper, the kind usually employed as a support for fine art drawing, to either side of a split frontal plane of the guitar. In addition to introducing color into the realm of sculpture, the blue strips of paper evoke a once unified pictorial ground of blue paper that has been divided, displaced, folded, and misaligned. Throughout these works, figure and ground, literal and depicted elements enter a zone of paradox and indeterminacy. Both cutting and drawing produce contours, which generally fail to coincide. Folding and pencil shading create contradictory effects of light and shade. Spatial depth is real, generated through literally projecting bent and overlapping elements, but it also emerges from pictorial devices such as shading, perspectival diminution, and more broadly, from the angled, inherently partial point of view. Picasso addressed a different set of pictorial devices in figure, executed sometime between 1928 and 1931 with the assistance of Julio González. Whereas the earlier constructed guitars of 1912 hung from wires and string like pictures on the wall, this diminutive sculpture now stands upright on the angled components of a rectangular picture frame, now broken into 2 intersecting pieces. By tilting this structure back and giving it a 3rd leg, Picasso also turned it into an easel balanced precariously on a tripod. Tangled and knotted iron wires with varying degrees of thickness climb up through and around this armature. These wire lines function as a form of inspired, even delirious drawing that suggests the emergence of a figure in the round, in defiance of the flat, delimited pictorial space constituted by the frame and/or easel structure. Unlike surrealist automatic drawing, Picasso's line never seems merely to register a passive or unconscious impulse on a neutral or given piece of paper. Instead, his line emerges as a willful force, one that enacts a charged relation both to the iron frame and to the void this frame does and does not contain. If we follow the development of a given line, starting at the lower right in this slide, for example, we can note that the line, the wire, begins in midair as an energized free vector that contrasts with the straight, leg-like strut of the frame or easel, a static element resting on the ground. This surging line wraps around this vertical bar, joining it to the diagonally projecting framing element. Then the line leaps across the empty space. Hopefully you can see that there. And then it loops up around the other leg and then springs upward where it disappears into a tangle of lines. To follow it further, we have to turn to the other side. But even from the front, we can see that thin wires, and is this a pointer? I don't know. Is that it? Right here. So you see the line wrapping around, and then here is what I'd like to point to. That at this juncture, the line begins to be a literal support mechanism. So I see it transferring from being a figurative virtual line, tracing movement in space, to offering literal weight-bearing support to the bar. Other lines operate similarly. At times, they seem self-propelled and may even break off suddenly as if flaunting their lack of completion, their refusal to provide closed contours to the virtual forms they project through complex interlacings. But at other times, they serve structural ends, or they may seem to revert to passive material as when the artist wraps or bends them tightly in place. The longer one looks, however, the more difficult it becomes to make such distinctions. The lines turn and twist into whorls that are both figural and structural, tracing virtual forms in space and simultaneously anchoring one another through loops, knots, and hooks. Wait a minute, I think, no, I have to go back. The frame itself can be read as a drawn contour, ironically positioned in an open, unbound, that is, unframed space. It depicts a pictorial limit that has no ability to contain the lines that surge past its upper edge, where they cluster in evocation of a head. But if the topmost bundle of lines hints at a head, then perhaps we can also read the top of the frame as evoking square shoulders and arms, or the whole framing rectangle as the geometric outline of a torso or body. In this and other works, Picasso integrates pictorial structures into the very core of his sculpture. In this case, the frame and/or easel, the picture plane, and the drawn line, but he also destabilizes their meaning. These pictorial elements are made to operate both as depicted forms and as weight-bearing structures in a chiasmic interplay of the two and the three-dimensional, the fictive and the real. A final reversal occurs when we attend to the shadows cast by figure, a translation of 90 degrees from the work's vertically rising three-dimensional forms into a flat horizontal register. Thus grounded, the forms assume new condensed shapes that nonetheless read as indexical signs of the objects that cast them, even as they point to contingencies of illumination and point of view. In 1938, Picasso executed a doll-like female figure out of a series of found and repurposed objects combined with drawn and painted wooden elements. From a distance, at least this is how I saw it, the doll's head appears to be an open, three-sided box with the nose and right eye, the left eye, and the mouth inhabiting divergent planes. On closer inspection, the viewer realizes that the facial plane is quite flat. The illusion of depth arises from the cut shape of the picture plane on which Picasso drew the internal edges of a trihedron, painting each side a different color, white, yellow, and blue. Here, cut edge and depicted edge function relationally, but they also yield different perspectival readings. If it is possible to see the box as an open volume, with the yellow plane at right paradoxically narrowing as it converges toward the spectator, one can also reverse this perception and see the box as closed, with the yellow plane on the right receding into depth. If the box appears as a closed form, however, then the mouth, affixed to the white plane, must project downward from its horizontal bottom plane. Yet the projecting eyes, mouth, and nose, made of screws, wires, and the metal join of a paintbrush, remain rigidly frontal, in contradiction of either of these illusory perspectival views. The figure's nose is made out of the ferrule, that little metal joining piece of a paintbrush. Her arms and hands are constructed out of fragments of two wooden paintbrush handles. Picasso nailed the right arm, painted bright purple and white, to the top back of the doll's cylindrical torso, whereas he affixed the left arm in white, green, and purple further down, using nails and string. Projecting slightly forward, the arms give a kind of awkward life to the doll, as if she were gesturing stiffly to the viewer. Signifying both childlike naivete and sophistication, the brush handles also realize the metaphorical link between the artist's own arm and hand and the brushes with which he worked, even on his sculptures. A similar metaphorical slippage occurs on the reverse side, where Picasso placed the cut sections of a push bell, a sound-making device, on either side of the doll's head, where they stand in for ears. Indeed, Picasso drew, painted, and otherwise worked on the sides and backs of most of his sculptures, often in ways that enhance or contradict their frontal view. With Bull of 1958, the artist insinuated a back view of the face onto its front by enclosing the face within a small picture frame, in reverse. This mise en abîme makes the face into a picture within a picture, perhaps even a portrait. Various kinds of wood, cut or fragmented and affixed to the surface of both sides of Bull, function as modes of drawing in shallow but real space, from the curving natural shapes of tree branches to the turned forms of furniture parts to ready-made lumber, including boards and studs, some of which had a previous life. Picasso treats nails as highly versatile elements. Driven into the surface of Bull on both sides, they produce coloristic or atmospheric effects. But at times they also serve to secure one wooden element, and I think we now know this is a piece of palm, if I understood correctly, which is really interesting. One wooden or palm element to another. The artist also bends nails around a branch, employing them almost like wire. And you can see that the nails that are circling around that palm piece are actually bent, so they're really treated as support. And he lets sharp points or lines perforate the picture plane. Similarly, two screws inserted into the bull's face become eyes, their drooping shadows evoking tears. The bulbous nose also casts a shadow which falls over the misaligned mouth, one of the few elements that Picasso carved into this assemblage. The head tilted slightly to the left, and there's always a slight tilt, which I think is very important, seems precariously held in place by elements that read variously as drawn lines and as supporting ledges, bars, or branches that pass to the right, below, and before the reverse-mounted frame. As these examples demonstrate, even the most plainer of Picasso's sculptures insist on being viewed from both sides, even from variable, sometimes intersecting angles. They take the conventional frontal address of the picture plane as a point of departure, transforming it into a material object in space through operations such as multiplying, folding, bending, cutting, tilting, overlapping, and perforating. The picture plane and its frame emerge as tangible material elements open to manipulation in space. Just as the drawn line, appearing in the form of twisted wires, curved branches, or cut edges, performs paradoxically as both fictive and real, as both the trace of an action in space and as an object able to cast a shadow in its own right. These pictorial structures appeal to our sense of sight as well as touch, spatial simultaneity as well as temporal unfolding. Ultimately, Picasso's sculptures engage the mind while intensifying the senses. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup Christine Poggi pour cette belle présentation sur la mise en abîme de la peinture par la sculpture et cette présence effectivement récurrente de cadres, de châssis, de chevalets dans la sculpture de Picasso. On aurait pu aussi citer à ce titre les baigneurs, où on retrouve dans le groupe des baigneurs en bois de Stuttgart des cadres qui servent à la fois effectivement à signifier la structure des personnages, où on voit que le cadre reprend la forme des épaules et des bras des personnages, et c'est tout à fait fascinant. Vous nous avez également montré qu'il y avait, par le biais de la couleur et cette variation sur le changement des points de vue, une temporalité inscrite dans la sculpture. Et c'est quelque chose qu'on avait entreaperçu aussi hier, que cette couleur, que cette polychromie permet d'inscrire une temporalité dans l'œuvre en 3 dimensions. Rapidement, est-ce que le public a des réactions? Est-ce que vous souhaitez poser des questions aux intervenants? Oui? Un micro, ce serait mieux.
In response to the last question, last paper rather, which I thought was extremely evocative, but my question is, where do we go from there? Where do we move from the formal analysis and try to contextualize it either within the history of sculpture or in a kind of socio-political context? So would you see the kind of interplay between the pictorial and the sculptural as a kind of revolution in the history of sculpture, or do you see it in response to other kinds of semiotic processes in the history of art or in kind of visual culture at the time?
Picasso does this so often and in such different historical contexts that I really hesitate to locate one specific, and in 15 minutes I couldn't really develop this in that sense, but I do think it would be interesting in each case to develop a kind of social historical context. But the strategy of thinking pictorially through sculpture, and sometimes vice versa as well, occurs so often that I don't think, each work has, from vastly different moments in his career, would have to be dealt with separately, and I don't think one could impose one set of sources or one set of constraints, historical or otherwise, to guide the whole series. To me, it expands in so many different directions, and he tries it out in so many different ways. So for me, one thing that is continuous, though, is the interaction of the visual and the tactile. And as a kind of critique of modernism, maybe even within modernism, but as a constant critique of the modes of representation, revealing them to be material, tactile, subject to the body, subject to actual perception in real space. What one could do some kind of phenomenological analysis, but I wouldn't want to do separate case studies of each of these different moments in terms of broader historical aspects.
Une autre question? Nous allons clôturer cette table ronde peinture et sculpture. Il y aurait en effet beaucoup à en dire encore.